Welcome, I'm Professor Kravit. In this video, I'm going to talk about the question, what is philosophy? And I'm really going to do that. I'm going to talk about the question. I'm not sure that I'm going to answer it, but I'm definitely going to investigate the question. Let's start by getting a closer look at the piece of artwork that's on the screen. So let's find out what it is, who made it. It's actually by a very famous artist. His name is Albrecht Dürer, and he was German, lived from 1471 to 1528, and he's also a theorist, philosopher. He's very important, very famous. In his day, he was friends with other great artists like Leonardo da Vinci. They actually exchanged letters. And this particular work is called Philosophia, and it's believed to have been made around 1502. And it's a wood print, which is an interesting artistic practice. Other artworks, you make one piece of art, right? One painting or one sculpture, and it can only exist in one place. Here, with this form of art, you carve out a block of wood, and then you can print many copies, so your artwork can really travel around. And in this case, philosophy is being printed out and spreading. So let's take a closer look at the composition. In the center is philosophy. This is a personification of philosophy. She is sitting on a throne, and on the sides of her head we have two words. We have Philo, Sophia. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then encircling her is great figures from philosophy. We could start at the top where we have Ptolemy, and Ptolemy's representing sort of ancient thought, Egyptian thought. He's coming out of Alexandria, which is now northern Egypt, and he's known because he's one of the first people to create a model of the universe, a geocentric model, and one backed up with mathematics and incredible mathematics that people of his day had trouble even understanding. And so Ptolemy is up there. Then if we circle around to I guess the left side of philosophy, we have ancient Greek, we have Plato there, and then at the bottom we have Roman philosophers, and we have two names in that circle. We have Cicero and Virgil, two important philosophers, thinkers there. And then if we go up in the last quadrant of the circle, we have Albertus Magnus, a great German philosopher. And German philosophy is very strong for a long period. What Albrecht Dürer is making this artwork, so that's represented there. And then in the corners, we have the four winds. This was important symbolism. Often the four winds sort of represented four different emotions or seasons. And one is sort of the storm wind. We have a gentle wind. We have the summer winds. And we have the winter wind. Okay. So, what is philosophy? Well, here we have a picture of philosophy. Is this how you would have drawn philosophy? I think personifications are interesting, right? If we turn an idea into a person, how would we draw that person? What would that person look like? In this case, philosophy, wearing this crown. Looks like a snaked crown. But it doesn't tell us what our definition of philosophy is, right? Personification sort of gives us an image, but still we can ask that question, what is philosophy? And here's where we come to a problem. Problem is, and I've given philosophy some laser eyes here, is that there's no general consensus definition. If you talk to professional philosophers, everyone's going to probably give you a slightly different definition. And some philosophers might be adamant about what philosophy is. And then you talk to somebody else and they do something completely outside of what this one philosopher said philosophy is. And now we have conflict. So no general consensus. How do we interpret that there is no general consensus? I like to think that there's two ways we can spin that. We can spin it in a positive sense. We could say that philosophy is something that's so broad and so deep that it's difficult to sum up, right? All these different methods and topics in sort of a brief, pithy statement, right? You can't capture it, so it's difficult to define. Though we could look at this in a more negative perspective. We could say that philosophy, there's a problem here. There's a confusion. And it's strange that philosophy wouldn't know how to define itself after so many millennia of philosophy being written about and practiced. So maybe there's actually a real problem with philosophy itself, that there's no consensus on the definition. Well, what we can come to a consensus on is the origin of that word philosophy. So we're going to look at the etymology, right? The study of the origin of words. And philosophy is two words that sort of were stuck together. They got glued together. One was philos, the other one sophos, right? Those are the words in the woodcut. And philos means love. Sophos means wisdom. And that word philos, when we talk about love, we're talking about real desire, erotic love, right? Where you long for something. And usually you don't long for something and desire something that you have. This is something you don't have, that you want, that you or at least want to be near, be beside. And so philosophy, one could say, and this is what Plato seems to write, is that philosophy is this pursuit of wisdom that's erotic. It's a desire for wisdom, something you don't have. Okay, well, there's one way of looking at the origin of the word philosophy, but some people have said, well, maybe it's not love of wisdom, maybe it's wisdom of love, right? Love is about bringing things together, and maybe that's what wisdom is about bringing different things together, ideas together, so that they make sense, so that we can sort of make connections, and that maybe those connections we make is understanding, is wisdom. Well, etymology does not solve our problem of what the definition of philosophy is, but it does give us a starting point to keep thinking about what it is. All right, here are 4 traditional branches of philosophy. If you go back through history, these were the 4 big areas. Metaphysics, which for now, this is just a short video. We're just trying to get a sense of philosophy here. Metaphysics, we could say, is the study of fundamental questions about existence. Epistemology, we could say, is a study of knowledge. Axiology, study of value. And logic, a study of rational thought. And I like to look at the etymology of words. I think it brings in another dimension and it spurs on thinking. So metaphysics is sort of 3 words glued together: meta, physis, and techne. And meta meant after, physis means nature, and techne means art, craft. It's a word that actually came to us from weaving, an ancient Greek language. And weaving was an important technology. And, right, it's fashion. Right? Fashion's important. Even back then, when you're wearing your tunics, your cloaks, you want to have good weaving. So this is the art, the craft of after nature. Doesn't make much sense. And here is a case where etymology doesn't give us as much insight into what people were thinking when they were trying to form this word. What metaphysics comes from is actually a librarian. And it comes from Aristotle. Aristotle, when he had passed away, where do you send all his books, all his lecture notes? Well, it was sent to Alexandria, right? where we have the Library of Alexandria, and so the librarians there are trying to figure out what order to put the books in. And there was many of these books were just sort of lecture notes. Not all of them had titles, but one definitely was called Nature. And the particular book that dealt with fundamental questions about existence and categories of existence, that got placed on the shelf right after Nature. So they just called that book after Nature, and added on over time, I guess, the art or craft, and or maybe those added then, I don't know. But I do know that it was a librarian. So that etymology doesn't help us much, but it is a very interesting story. Okay, epistemology. Here we have the word episteme, and the latter half of the word is from ancient Greek word called logos, which is also in logic and in axiology. It shows up a lot. So episteme was the word for knowledge, and logos is a really interesting word. It's the word for word. So it's sort of self-referencing. It's a strange word. It's the kind of thing that you get lost in deep thought, the word for word. But what are words, right? Words give things meaning. Things are not meaningful until we can put them into words, right? Until we can talk about them and describe them. We do all that using words. So this word for word came to mean to put things into words, to give an account, to make something intelligible. So we're giving an account of knowledge here in epistemology. And in axiology, we're giving an account of value or worth, because axios meant worth, worthy. And finally, logic is just logos itself, and techne, sort of the art of making things intelligible. Okay, let us actually expand out a little bit with axiology, because most of you are saying the study of value, what's that? Where did that go in philosophy? Well, it breaks down into different types of value, like ethics, and ethics is about moral value, right? Something is morally good, it has moral value, it's moral worth. Something is morally bad, right? It lacks value or has negative value. So we have ethics, the study of human conduct, goals, and character, and the moral values and principles that govern them. But in axiology, we also have things like aesthetics, which is often a study of beauty in art, and something called the sublime. And so beauty, wait, that also has value, and is something we can talk about. And what constitutes that value? Is it the object just as a characteristic, something's beautiful? Or is something beautiful not really say anything about the object itself, but it's more about the person looking at it, and that I see that as beautiful, right? And so it becomes a question of whether value is something that's subjective, it's a matter of the person who's viewing it, or if it's something objective, it's a characteristic of the object. And social and political philosophy, I'm going to throw in here an axiology. That doesn't often happen, but one of the things that Aristotle does is he really ties together these sorts of philosophy with ethics, where ethics is sort of individual decision-making, individual action, and the character of the individual. And then political philosophy, social philosophy, is where you look at the same sorts of questions, but for larger groups. Either it's just a group, or it could be something that's more organized into a state or a nation and become more political, right? The question no longer is what should I do, but what should we do? Or who am I, but who is this nation? What is the character of this nation? Okay, so also give you a little bit of etymology on those. So ethics comes from ethos and then techne, right? The ick part is techne. Ethos being a word that sort of meant like a pattern or a manner of life. It's not just like you did something once. It's you did it a bunch of times, enough that you could say this is how people live, right? And then you could talk about whether it was a good way of living or one that wasn't so good. Aesthetics comes from aestheticos, and that word with also the techne that word meant sensory experience, because usually beauty and a lot of things we talk about in aesthetics uh, occurs, we encounter it through our sensory experience, but not all the time, right? In 20th century, we now have conceptual art that we don't actually encounter through our senses. It's an idea that someone presents to us and we think about it and we talk about the beauty of that idea. Okay, and then social and political philosophy, socius, goes back to the Latin. There's a word for a friend or someone you follow, someone who you associate with. And political, the first part is polis, which was the word for city, right? A group of people coming together and organizing and forming a constitution. Okay, so that's a little bit of the story of traditional areas of philosophy. I want to end here with some important areas in contemporary philosophy. And there's a lot of different active areas where people are doing research, they're writing articles, and all of these areas are helping to advance and reshape philosophy itself. So we have history of philosophy, looking at the whole history of ideas, of thoughts, and rethinking that history, challenging it. A huge amount of work in philosophy is in women's studies, right? And there's a lot of things going on in all these different categories. So I'm just pointing out one or two things that are interesting. In women's studies, we have in many ways a reevaluation of philosophy from a different perspective, because historically, traditionally, philosophy has been written by men, and whatever perspective you have, you can see certain things, but you can't see other things. If we look back at that woodcut, right, how was philosophy personified? As a woman surrounded by men, right? And that wasn't really challenged or thought about that much. It was just, oh yeah, that's what philosophy is, right? And we could go and we could say, well, what gets packed into that image that might not be what we want to say philosophy is about, right? What is it including that shouldn't be there, or what is it missing? All those sorts of things can come out when we are able to approach philosophy from these different perspectives, different disciplines. Queer studies, another really important area in philosophy that's rethinking many things in philosophy. When we look at that image, right, it's very heterosexual. It's all these men surrounding this woman. And again, in that sort of power dynamic, there's a lot of things assumed in that we might want to rethink. We might want to look at alternative ways, or at least have other ways of thinking philosophy so we can have a more broad perspective on it. Black studies, very important philosophy right now, dealing with race. You hear a lot about critical race theory. Most people don't even know what critical race theory is, but they talk about it. A lot of very interesting things, again, happening in that area of philosophy. Thing I'm going to point out right now is that it's helping to rethink philosophy. A lot of philosophers had views that were frankly racist, and they were important philosophers and they had racist views, and we need to go back and look at them and figure out what was happening. Disability studies, also really important area in philosophy, and helps us to rethink sort of just our concept of the person. Right? A lot of times we have in philosophy idolized the human nature, and forgotten that all people need tools to get through life, and we need support systems and to do things that we can do, but not without a support system. So disability studies has really helped challenge sort of what it means to be a person. Okay, African philosophy, very important, and gives us an entryway into post-colonial thought, which is another thing that needs to be worked out in philosophy and in life. We have Latin American philosophy, which also is dealing with post-colonial thought, and there's a lot of work there with indigenous thought, which is very important. Philosophy of science is very active because science is so important. And scientists do a lot of work, but they don't always sit and think about what things mean and or what their methods might mean or assume. And so there's a lot of work in philosophy of science that works hand in hand with science and actually helps improve science. Philosophy of religion, right, is not about doing religion, but about trying to understand religion, understand the language of religion, looking at different religions and trying to understand differences and also similarities. And so religion's a big part of modern life. And so philosophy of religion is also a very important area of philosophy. Applied ethics is something that is, I consider, more modern, even though ethics is, part of axiology. Applied ethics takes ethics and applies it to different sort of professional environments or current concerns like medical ethics or business ethics, and also environmental ethics and animal ethics are important areas in philosophy that are actually, the research in all of these has an impact on the rest of philosophy. So I highly recommend you take a course in any of these disciplines. And there's philosophy of mind that really looks into what does it mean to have a mind. It's a strange thing to be conscious. We know a lot about the physical brain, but what's the connection between the physical brain and the experience that emerges from that? And how do we want to talk about that? Is it something that emerges, or is that the wrong way to think about it? A lot of questions in philosophy of mind are going to sort of address that. And finally, philosophy of language is important, right? We talked about logos, putting things into words. Shouldn't we, if in philosophy we're using words all the time, have a better understanding of language itself and what we're doing? So there's a lot of deep reflection in philosophy of language about what these words that we're throwing out there actually do and how it works. Okay, there's my video. I didn't give you an answer to what is philosophy, but I gave you a lot to think about, and hopefully you'll consider studying more philosophy in all these different areas.